Okay, hello everybody. Switching to English, I hope that's okay for you all. I'm Stuart Broadley, CEO of the EIC, which stands for Energy Industries Council. We're the UK's largest energy trade association, and one of the world's largest actually now, with approaching 1,000 members. All of our members are in the energy supply chain, covering all energy sectors. And I'm delighted to be here today to talk a bit about the energy markets, and particularly what's happening globally in those markets, and latest thinking around the energy trilemma. Just a little bit on EIC and what we do. We've been around a long time, since 1943. We work closely with the British government, but we're not funded by them. Our goal is to help companies to move from basically from perhaps centered in one country to be global, and to be not involved in one energy sector, but to be involved in all energy sectors. And we have a lot of data to help them pursue the best opportunities around the world, whether it's new energy projects or whether it's a service on existing energy facilities. We also have a lot of data on what supply chain companies do, what strategies they use, what capabilities they have. And if you ever go to an energy, a large energy conference, and you see a UK pavilion, it's normally us that runs that. We also do a lot of events like this every year, about 250 all around the world. Our flagship event is actually in Aberdeen in Scotland in a month's time. And it's called the Energy Exports Conference. And perhaps maybe I'll see some of you in person there. So let's get to the presentation itself. I think the first questions to ask are around kind of this speed of change of the energy market. And it's changing all the time, of course. And specific to that, how do the energy transition technologies fit in? Some data, this is EIC data. Perhaps helps us to understand why it feels so much like oil and gas is moving away so quickly, and yet those companies that are active in the supply chain would say it's not. So this is data that is looking at all energy sectors, and this is global data, and it's looking at projects announced in 2021. So quantity of projects announced, not value. And you can see here that by far the largest quantity of projects announced was renewables. So that's onshore wind and solar PV and hydroelectric, basically. And then you can see many others. Oil and gas is here sort of listed downstream, midstream, upstream, decommissioning. So in quantity terms, not so many projects announced. And just to try and simplify what this chart says, if you look on the right-hand donut, really it summarizes it by saying that mature hydrocarbons and power, so the kind of the traditional markets, are 22% of the announcements, whereas 20% are in this energy transition space, these new technologies. So this would include energy storage, floating offshore wind, hydrogen, carbon capture. So again, it feels like that's a huge growth from almost nothing 2 years ago. So if you just listen to the quantity data, then you'd say, wow, oil and gas is dying. But if you change that and now look at the value data rather than the quantity data, it's a very different picture. And again, if you look on the right-hand side, which is the summary chart, it clearly shows that energy transition, and these were this is now converted to the value, and the value is then looked at all the projects that have been announced really at the start of 2021, and how they then cascade through to value, if they all happen, through 2021 and then over a 5-year period. Actually, the energy transition may be 20% of the projects, but it's only 2% of the value. Whereas you can see oil and gas then becomes the largest part of the donut in value terms. So, okay, this is, I think, explains to a degree why there's this conflict in feeling about, well, we want to be involved in hydrogen, say, and yet the reality is I can't find a project, I can't participate, because the reality is there's a lot of quantity of projects, very small value. Most of them, by the way, of course, also not yet funded. So they're not real yet. They're announced, but not real. But I have some extra data here, which is interesting. So this was kind of early 21 data, or at the end of 2020. You just go forward 1 year to the end of 2022. So I'll just show the difference between these 2 years. Right? You can see how energy transition has grown significantly in value terms just in 1 year. So at the start of this year, actually, there has been a lot more value of projects added into the pipeline. And so something's definitely happening, right? So energy transition is not a dream. It's something is really happening. But still, what's important if you're in the investment game in energy terms is oil and gas is still by far the largest. The mature renewables and sort of clean tech markets, so this is onshore wind, offshore wind, solar PV, hydroelectric, is a big market and growing. But I guess the point is, you know, the best businesses, where possible, are active in all of these sectors, not just one. Looking a bit at hydrogen, it is incredible to see what's happened to the hydrogen market since 2019, really, and so really at the start of the COVID pandemic. Previous to that, the normal number of projects announced in any 1 year for hydrogen of any color was between 5 and 10 a year, and that was normal. And then COVID hit, and a sort of psychology of COVID was to then fix the planet, solve the planet's issues, and hydrogen became a big way of driving that. So 100 projects announced in 2020, nearly 200 announced in 2021. And another 100 announced in the first 3 months of this year. Quite incredible. What is important to note is most of them are green projects. So green hydrogen, which is the production of hydrogen using electrolysis, and the electrolysis is powered through renewable power. So through offshore wind or through solar PV or so on. So if you hear all this talk about hydrogen, the reality is the buyers of hydrogen, the off-takers, the funders of these projects, they want truly renewably powered and produced hydrogen more than they want the oil industry to come in. And this is at the moment, right? This is a lot of these projects are still in the sort of pilot stage. So in that stage, companies saying, no, we want true renewable powered hydrogen. Now, as these projects grow to more scale, there is an argument to say that then that becomes a very expensive proposition, and blue hydrogen, so the oil industry's basically existing processes for producing hydrogen, but then capturing the CO2 and storing that may be a much cheaper way and a much more scalable way of producing hydrogen. So that's one of the big questions of the future. It's also interesting just to look at which countries are biggest in hydrogen terms here. And this was just looking at the number of projects announced in 2021. So it's just one snapshot. Hydrogen dominates the Australian energy market at the moment, but is also quickly growing in a number of other areas. The UK, if you look at England and Scotland, which are number 4 and number 5 combined, and actually UK is second in the world in number of projects being announced. And this is, again, many of these projects are not yet financed. That's a general point that we can be aware of. And then just another point on hydrogen. Around the world now, it feels like hydrogen is now a given and everybody needs to participate. But the truth is that it depends where you are in the world. So you can see in Northwest Europe or Western Europe, let's say, the maturity of hydrogen policies and strategies is furthest ahead. And this is a chart that looks at kind of government strategy announcements, commitments, moving into legislation. Obviously, you can look at other parts of the world where much further behind. Many parts of the world not even made any general statements yet about hydrogen. So absolutely not yet a globally aligned move towards hydrogen being say, the replacement for gas. But in Europe, it's and continues every day to be more and more important. So this is all great, all very exciting, and arguably the biggest opportunity for industry and for investors that we've seen for 100 years. The scale of this net zero challenge, but is it doable? And so I just using the UK as an example, but I think many countries would have a similar way of thinking about, is this doable? So this is the supply chain analysis that, again, we have in EIC, which looks at different energy sectors and what's the strength in our supply chain. And obviously, the more capacity and proven capability you have in your supply chain, the more likely you are to be able to accelerate and implement, government policy changes, new technology opportunities, and so on. So this is an overall look at the UK supply chain. We have approximately 3,400 suppliers in the energy supply chain. This is defined as companies with more than £1 million of revenue. We actually have about 10,000 companies in the supply chain, but this long tail of smaller companies I remove for the purpose of this analysis. And you can see here, obviously we have a lot of companies that are already diversified into many sectors. So oil and gas, though, it far dominates. More than 80% of our supply chain is strongly in oil and gas and has been for decades now. But we do have now more than 1,000 moving into renewables. More than 1,000 have been for a long time in conventional, and less than 1,000 in nuclear. So, okay. If you now look at oil and gas and the sort of strategies that we're considering in terms of using the oil and gas industry to transition into areas like hydrogen and carbon capture, you see we have a significant engineering and manufacturing capability in the UK. I think this should give us confidence in the UK and other countries. If they had a similar breakdown of capability inside their country, it should give them more confidence that if they set a policy to say we go net zero fast and we need the energy industry to support it using oil and gas technology, then I think this data would say in the UK we should have confidence that we can do this. So that something like blue hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, floating offshore wind, perhaps, which uses a lot of sort of overlapped offshore platform technologies, floating technologies, would give us confidence. There are less good bits of the story, though. So if you look at our offshore wind capabilities, and in the UK right now, and this is common in many parts of the world now, offshore wind is seen as the fastest and most scalable way of growing renewable power capability. We don't have huge solar capability in the UK, so offshore wind is our biggest opportunity. Other countries, perhaps Turkey, has more solar opportunity as well. But still, the point is you need a lot of renewable power generation capability to allow things like electric vehicles to happen and to electrify in oil industries and so on. And in the UK, we certainly have a lot of coastline and a lot of ability to license and build offshore wind farms, but our supply chain is much weaker. And if you look at the capabilities of our supply chain here, operation and maintenance, turbine construction, that is basically the process of constructing the turbine in the water. It's not the process of building it in a factory. Development and consenting to the legal process, balance of plant. Where are the capabilities in the UK for the core process of designing and building the turbine, the nacelle, the gearbox? We don't have them, actually. So therefore, our ability in the UK to control our own destiny for offshore wind is much weaker. And so this would mean, effectively, if we want to build a lot of offshore wind, we have to import it from overseas. So that's a weaker policy link to the supply chain. And you kind of need to be aware of this at the country level when you're thinking about how to move forward with policy. Okay, so now this is kind of in my final section, is so how do you make decisions around net zero when there is clearly still so much uncertainty in the world? Or perhaps put it another way, can we afford not to invest in sustainability and net zero? So firstly, of course, COP26, which the UK was the proud host of at the end of 2021. It seems like a long time ago now, doesn't it? But there were some good things that happened. 19 countries committing to ending public financing for fossil fuel projects abroad. Seemed like a good thing, a good announcement to make. Only 19 though, right? Many others did not. $130 trillion worth of money, potential money, managed by banks, insurers, and investors, now put at the disposal of climate change projects. Actually, of course, today there are not enough projects to use all of that potential money. But still, I think that was quite a brave announcement to make, pledge to make. And I think what's perhaps for many people, what was the most surprising and pleasing to see at COP26 was that 130 countries promised to work collectively to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by only 2030, very fast deadline. So there were some good things at COP. But there are many other things happening which are kind of beyond the sort of pledging. There are real things happening. So I'm fascinated by Elon Musk, and he doesn't wait for policy, right? You know, he runs businesses based upon what he thinks is right. He does his own independent analysis, and he goes. And he's a genius, of course, at raising money. And so now he's built the world's, you know, the most valuable car company, but valuable so much that it's more valuable than all the other car companies put together. Depending upon when you look at the share price and whether he's messing around with Twitter or whatever, his price goes up and down. But incredible the value he's created. And so Tesla has created policies as an outcome. Countries now feel electric vehicles are possible because of him. So entrepreneurs have a role in achieving net zero, not just policymakers. But if you look on the right, of course, policymakers are also important. And here you see in Scotland, for instance, this huge announcement, almost a surprising announcement to create offshore wind, you know, and floating offshore wind capability all around the coastline. Very brave policy making. Offshore wind, of course, is a market that's been around really now for 20 years and is quite mature now as an industry, and very tight margins. If you're active in offshore wind now, you will know the margins are tight. But the UK used to be able to say proudly up until 2 years ago that we were the largest producer of offshore wind in the world. Well, China has just changed that. Look at the amazing growth of China. Incredible. And this is just the beginning of the offshore wind boom globally. And then, of course, now we have the oil boom. And after the 14-15 oil crisis, perhaps some of us thought that we'd never get back to a cyclic oil boom and bust cycle, but it feels like we are right back there now. And of course, that was happening after COVID, as demand came in all around the world and there was not enough oil supply, and then Ukraine is just worse than that. And I think as I sort of come to wrap up with my last couple of slides, there is a question now about net zero and, you know, how fundamental could this be for industry, investors, and the world? It reminds me a bit of the net zero bubble being like the dot-com bubble. For those of you that remember that back at the end of the 90s and the start of the noughties, how there was a huge rush of investment into these new markets opened up by the internet. And of course, that's created today many of the world's most valuable businesses, and including Elon Musk, who of course came out of the PayPal opportunity from that, but many others, Google, Amazon, and so on. So is net zero the new dot-com bubble, the new sort of similar cycle of such significant growth, not yet supported and achieved by any one company? Huge opportunity almost for anybody to participate, any country, any investor, if they're brave enough, can go for it. There will be many failures, but there will be many who succeed and become the billionaires or trillionaires of the future. So it feels like it's a once in a lifetime or once in 20 or 30 year bubble of opportunity. But now we come to the energy trilemma and how it's really hard to know how it's shifting so fast, right? So obviously, we're at a time right now where we have high gas prices, we have affordability concerns in most countries of the world. Consumers are under huge pressure. We have inflationary issues. This just feels so different from what it was like just a year ago with COP26, when the priority was all about sustainability and energy transition. And of course, now in the last 3 months, it's been about energy security. So completely moved, it feels, from energy transition to energy security, as countries, particularly in Europe, realize that they're over-reliant on Russian oil and gas and need to put their own needs and supply capabilities first. But bubbling away below the surface of all of this is whether it's reacting to COVID or reacting to the energy security concerns around the invasion of Ukraine. Still, at the end of the day, it's all very expensive, and we can't afford to do all these things, and yet we can't afford to not do it. So who pays? And at some point, this probably will lead to some kind of breaking point. So in summary, the market says that we're in a phase of huge growth across all market sectors. And net zero is a big part of that. And there's a lot of ambition. And we are coming into perhaps the new dot-com bubble, perhaps call it the net zero bubble. And that technology is exciting, but it's not coming fast enough. And there's a lot of announcements. Actually, the value of those projects is not there yet. So the supply chain has to be clever in thinking about how it takes advantage of those opportunities, but also stays active in existing technologies like oil and gas, because that's where most of the money will be for the next 10 to 20 years, whether you like it or not. But there will continue to be a lot of uncertainty. And perhaps the next thing that will happen in this hyperinflation, hence my little picture of a balloon means inflation, is in the affordability crisis around energy transition, energy trilemma, which is definitely coming. This will probably lead to a world recession, certainly a European recession. And maybe that's just around the corner. Maybe it's 3 years away. I don't know. But I think my summary statement, therefore, is flying safely is hard to do, but there is money to be made. So that's me. Thank you very much. I will now end the presentation there.